Hey, welcome back. This is our final lecture for the North American section. So this is lecture number 3 in this unit. So we're going to wrap up and talk about the last couple sections of the chapter. If I can get going, sorry. Okay, so a lot of times when we talk about these regions, I know this is the first region we're officially talking about, but a lot of times in really helping us to understand what is going on and what are some of the issues and how this region is currently interacting with the world and understand how it will continue to interact with the world, a lot of times we actually need to go back in history and understand the historical context or the historical perspective, we would call it. So this is really understanding how the country was formed, what is the basis for this country, and understanding how this country might be similar or different than other countries will give us a lot of insight most times to understand why the current context is the way it is. I've had some interesting conversations when I've traveled, this is years ago now, sitting at a table, for example, probably at some cafe having a beer with a Kiwi, somebody from New Zealand, somebody from Australia, somebody from Ireland, somebody from South Africa, usually not English. I think this one particular conversation I'm thinking of, we had people from literally most what are now would be independent nations or independent countries that were previously or at some point had been an English colony. And I don't think England was actually at the table, from what I can recall. But we were having this interesting political conversation about our current, and again, this was probably 10 to 15 years ago, but we were having this conversation about why they were the way they were in each of our countries, because in many ways we all share a lot of historical contexts, especially being English colonies, but we saw a clear difference in some of our perspectives, some of our contemporary perspectives, and how our countries were formed. So the United States versus Canada versus Ireland versus, Ireland is quite distinct because Ireland wasn't an English colony per se, but it had been English territory. But if I'm not mistaken, the Irish just gained independence. 1937 for some reason is popping out in my head, but I think it was like in the 1930s. But we had an interesting perspective of how our countries interacted with Indigenous people, how our countries were formed. So even though we had a lot of similarities, again, this is just kind of an example to point out, coming from countries and talking about countries that I'm assuming most of you should be aware of, especially in the United States, how understanding historical contexts can really help us understand what's going on today. So, again, talking about North America, we're primarily referring to the United States and Canada. So the United States was 13 colonies originally. I had an interesting conversation with my son about this a couple months ago when he came home for Thanksgiving week. On Monday, it was, what was it? He came home talking about the Pilgrims. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, teacher that I am, I don't ask, I didn't say anything. I just kind of, well, what do you know about the Pilgrims? Oh, the Pilgrims were the ones that saved our country. And I'm like, thinking in my head, okay, we'll just see how this develops throughout the week. And on Thursday, we'll wait till you're out of school and we'll have a little bit more of a realistic conversation about the events. By Tuesday, he came home and he knew quite a bit about the I can't even pronounce the indigenous populations that the Pilgrims had interacted with. And he could pronounce it, and he broke it down. I don't think it was correct, but he broke it down and told me, well, this word means this, and this part of the word means this, and this is what it translates to. I was really quite impressed that they'd actually gone into that much detail. I don't think we ever got that much detail when I was in kindergarten way back when. And then by Wednesday, there was a bit more of a picture. And so then we had a really frank conversation after that and talking about, what I think that Thanksgiving should be about and what are the things that I think we should remember, but most clearly, and my son I'm white, so he's half white, but he does not look white at all. He doesn't look white, he's not white. And so, we just had a very frank conversation about what the day really represented. But this is a huge perspective, and I think especially when it comes to a lot of our history is understanding that we were we were founded by Puritan pilgrims that were, a lot of their, a lot of this religious conservatism, I think people would argue, could be tied back to those origins of our quote unquote founding fathers, even though at the time, a lot of, it was seeking religious freedom. A lot of that kind of freedom, or seeking freedom and being able to believe what you wanted to be, was largely lost. And then this was obviously followed by the Revolutionary War about a century later. And then, talking about the expansion of our country. And this is a huge factor in a lot of the way our political decisions, our geopolitics have been influenced. Comes from this complete expansion from one coast to the next. So this was through the Louisiana Purchase largely. And there was this concept called manifest destiny, which most of you should know about if you studied American history, which was, was believed that it was our destiny to literally, control this continent from coast to coast. And again, there's, I'm not really going to go into this too much. Your book talks about it, but it was a huge concept and a huge factor in U.S. politics at the time. And, it's largely, there's a lot of racism involved in this as well. And partially that was due to the time. But a lot of these concepts and values, I would still argue, that are very prevalent today in American culture as well. Canada was a little different. So when we declared independence and then fought in the Revolutionary War, a great number of people who were living in, wasn't quite the United States, but the American colonies, that pledged allegiance to Britain, they actually fled for Canada. Tens of thousands of people fled. So right there, without really considering this, why is the difference between Canada and the United States? How is our relationship so different with Britain? Right there is a huge factor. In Canada, on the other hand, rather than just possessing and purchasing and having quite as forceful of an acquisition of the rest of the continent, they had a much more peaceful acquisition and a much more peaceful growth. I'm not saying it was all perfect and idealistic, but in comparison to that growth of the United States, it was much more peaceful. And I mean, obviously, we could have a whole year worth of courses just understanding more of the history of this, but just to kind of give you a brief comparative context. So today, and a lot of the things we'll talk about as well, is free trade organizations, free trade agreements that we have all over the world. NAFTA is with just, it also includes Mexico. North America Free Trade Agreement with Canada, Mexico, and the United States is the world's largest trading bloc. Your book provides a lot of statistics regarding how much of the exports go to each country. The majority of Canadian exports do come to the United States, so this is a very advantageous trading agreement for Canada. And so basically the free trade agreement, where we have wreaked quite a bit of havoc and damage for Mexican economies and in many market and segments, but largely for the United States and for Canada has been quite advantageous. So for a long time, this was considered the world's largest open border. However, we have seen some changes over the last couple of decades. There was, I think it was probably only about, it was less than 20% of Americans, of United States citizens, had passports until it was post 9/11, where eventually changes in security now required people traveling to and from Canada to actually obtain a passport. So we've seen a lot more strict movement between the border. There have been some political conflicts as well. This has largely been regarding natural resource use. As pollution, contamination, water pathways, they're not, borders are a human construct. We have created borders, and doesn't mean that nature will respect the borders that we put in place. So there have been some conflicts. Your book lists a couple of the conflicts that are some examples of this, but there's nothing like major conflicts. These are just more like potentials for conflicts. And another good example, oh, so sorry, both of these countries are also federal states, meaning that there is a central government, but largely we recognize the autonomy of different states, or in Canada, this would be provinces. And again, this largely goes back to the creation of the colonies, as well as the our revolutionary, the reasons that the United States colonies wanted to, or the U.S. colonies, sorry, and the American colonies wanted to, since I can't really say United States because that's the name of the country, and at the time it wasn't a country. But a lot of this, the way our government is structured and the level of autonomy that we have is largely related to the fact that, we had a centralized government coming from England, and we didn't like the way that we were being ruled by the centralized government. And so a lot of this then has influenced the way that these governments have formed. We really haven't seen that besides the Civil War. There hasn't been too much conflict. Canada has seen a bit more conflict, especially in the last few decades. Largely again because they have, for example, we refer to as the Quebec dispute. So you had French populations and English populations, and then depending on which type of national government won, which direction the government was leaning. So it's just been not really dispute as in like an armed conflict, but there have been some government level conflict as well in that region. Your book talks about that a little bit. So immigration policy is something that I'd like to touch as well, especially now with everything that's been going on. So there's 4 key issues that your book talks about regarding U.S. immigration and politics, and these are the issues that tend to be at the forefront of contemporary politics. I can't remember if it was this section or not. Your book has a very interesting, actually it's in North America, was regarding healthcare, and you'll see towards the end of the chapter if you haven't read it already, where they talk about, the United States has been leaning towards the universal healthcare coverage, which in a post-Trump era, I read this book was obviously written pre-Trump. And this is obviously the opposite drastic of that. We are now moving further away from a universal healthcare coverage. So there are certain things that your book is not completely up to date in, just because, politics, everything's constantly changing. It's really hard to be completely up to date on. So for the most part, I would agree that these still are quite the leading issues in U.S. immigration politics. So the question is, how many is too many? A lot of the argument is centered around that too many immigrants risks U.S. jobs, and it also prevents assimilation. So immigrants coming into the country are not assimilating; they're not mixing in with a mainstream U.S. culture. And then the opposite spectrum is that people would argue that more immigrants can boost economic growth and business expansion. In reality, when you move away from the bipartisan arguments and you actually do an economic study, they do find that immigrants, including refugees, have actually boosted economic growth and business expansion. So the latter tends to be true. A second key issue that's often debated is that daily flows of undocumented immigrants, they provide a national security issue. We have at this to the heart is this concept of fencing issue. So what most people aren't aware is that border walls don't work. There is a professor at University of Hawaii, his name is Rhys Jones, and his specialization is border walls. And he will be the first person to tell you that border walls do not work. Not necessarily something to be concerned of. Currently, the U.S.-Mexican border already has a lot of walls in place, and the only places really that walls can be additionally built up, we're talking about not just a couple sections with walls, I'm talking about hundreds, if not, I want to say thousands of miles, 1,000 miles at least. I should go back and actually look at that. But there's expansive walls, and the only places really that walls can continue to be built are in places so desolate that people can't humanly cross those areas. And actually, they've seen dramatic increases when they build walls, that then we start seeing a lot more loss of life because people are now still making the attempts to cross the border, but they have to go further and further into the middle of the desert, for example. And this is a human, uh, there's a humanitarian issue as well, that people are dying. Um, the third issue would be the U.S.-Mexican relations. They are not the best, and this has been something that is not a new issue. And there's a lot of concern about the effectiveness of police, especially in the northern Mexican states. A lot of drug trafficking issues, a lot of violence, a lot of loss of human life, Mexican people disappearing, often in large quantities, even at one time. And then there is also the question of what to do with existing undocumented workers. So, U.S. papers are not easy to, U.S. Citizenship is not an easy thing necessarily to obtain. Obviously, if you're born in the United States, it is much easier. You're automatically obtained, but you automatically, there is a question of being able to have some type of papers. If you're born, there's almost this legal human rights to have existence, to have a legal existence. But there are several people who, most of you might be aware of, the Dreamers, they tend to be called, and hoping at least you've heard of these somewhere in the media. DACA refers to the DREAM Act, which referred to children who were brought to the United States before the age of 18. So previously, what has happened is they come into the country, they don't have papers. Once you are entitled to health care, you're entitled to a high school education, a basic education. But after that, as most of you, I'm not sure if you're aware, but to register for university, to enroll in university, you have to have a social security number. At most states, including Hawaii, to get a driver's license, you have to have a social security number. So a lot of these people, maybe even excellent students, graduate and then they don't have a social security number. They can't legally work. They can't legally go to school after a high school education. So what do we do with these people? So it was originally talked about, the DREAM Act was originally discussed for Bush. Can't remember if it was Clinton or not. I know Bush was definitely talking about it, the second President Bush. And then 9/11 happened and we went to war in 2003 and basically all discussion stopped. And then it was talked about again under the Obama administration. And so basically a provisional safety net was entitled for these people, where they can apply for some type of legal status, provisional status, but no actual definition, no actual long-term plan has ever been decided. And as you are probably aware, hopefully aware, is that the Trump administration originally took away any type of legal protection for these people, and it has been a little bit more recently where the Supreme Court said, well, actually, you can't do that without having some other option for them. So these are the huge issues right now that are at the heart of U.S. Immigration politics. Hegemony. So I don't know if anybody's heard of this, but hegemony is a leadership or dominance, especially by one country or social group over others. When we're talking about hegemonic force, we're talking about largely a economic system and a political system, military force within the world. Previously, if you just Wikipedia, you'll get hegemonic forces. I think it was England or Holland was the Netherlands was a hegemonic force once or twice. I'm trying to think who else it was. Spanish or Portugal was even pre that era, especially during like the early slave trade. And the U.S. has largely agreed to be the hegemonic force post World War II, when Europe was no longer allowed, or no longer able, I should say, to maintain control of a lot of their colonies, and they were restructuring, rebuilding. Um, so how we saw our rise to hegemony would be largely after the Spanish-American Wars. This was the beginning of it, which was in 1889, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so after the Spanish-American War, which was basically to say that Spain, you shouldn't be involved in the New World politics, we quote-unquote won the Spanish-American War, and that is how we saw some provisional independence of Puerto Rico. That's how we got our hands on Guam, on Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, which was just became a U.S. territory. Interestingly, has never technically been an independent nation. Went from being a European or a Spanish territory to a U.S. territory, and technically a Commonwealth. And then after that, is through President Monroe, we declared this thing called the Monroe Doctrine. I had a student last semester. I asked him, I tried to get my students to say, well, what does it mean in your layman terms? What does it mean? And he basically said, F off. F off Europe, these be my biatches. And it was actually a really great way of summing it up in words that students can understand. Because the Monroe Doctrine was basically a policy that the United States said to the rest of Europe, you can see up there on the top right, was stay out of Europe, or sorry, stay out of the Americas, don't get involved. And then subsequently we had the Spanish-American War. After the Monroe Doctrine, we saw, and this is talking about our rise to hegemony, so we saw World War I, World War II, where each time we were more or less called in to help. And then we began to see this, our role as becoming the savior. We saw a variety of wars after this, the Korean War, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, currently the war against terrorism, the war against ISIS or ISIL, which we'll talk about later. So we have been, quote unquote, kind of viewed ourselves as the saviors of the world. And through that, a lot of people would argue is we've kind of begun to see ourselves as a world leader. I'm not saying we aren't a world leader, but we've definitely played a very large role in influencing and controlling what happens around the world. And now this kind of comes back to in a contemporary time. A lot of geographers and political scientists would argue that this is an outdated concept, and a lot of what we are trying to do is hold on to our role as a world leader, where this is a really outdated concept that kind of needs to be put at rest. And if we can't change our mindset from being a hegemonic force to accepting that we can be a world leader without being the best person on the playground, then our role obviously will eventually diminish. We're kind of fighting a battle that we can't win. I think in many ways, probably the best anecdote that comes to mind is you have the popular quarterback in high school who is the prom king and largely does quite well in high school, and they have now moved on, but they haven't moved on. They've graduated and they've left high school, but they haven't actually changed, and they still think of themselves as, the top dog, doing quite well compared to most other people. And in reality, the world has moved on, and it is no longer important who was high school football star or who was the prom king. That's kind of like a phase that we've moved past, yet it kind of questions whether or not the United States, has been able to accept that it doesn't matter who was prom king anymore, if this kind of makes sense. So if we want to stay up and continue to be an influence in world politics, we need to accept that we are one of many at a table rather than the leader at the table. So agriculture. Agriculture is really important to U.S. economy. not necessarily for jobs, but we do have one of the most highly commercialized, mechanized, and specialized agricultural industries. So we have a huge play in global markets. And actually, global markets has a huge play in our agricultural system as well. Transportation, large capital investment, these are all characteristics. We have a highly industrialized agricultural system in this country. And I'll show you a picture of this. It's large, it's a dominant land used across much of the region of the United States as well as parts of Canada. Canada is quite a bit colder. They don't have quite as much viable agricultural land as we do. However, it's a very small percentage of the labor force in the United States is actually involved in agriculture, 1% in the United States and 2% in Canada. Again, this comes to the fact that it's highly mechanized. And what we've seen, and generally the trend, is that the number of farms has significantly dropped, but the size of farms has significantly increased. This is what we refer to as agribusiness. So it's large-scale industrialized corporate farming, which is very different than what we see in the majority of the rest of the world. And there's a lot of issues that are related to this large-scale farming, NAFTA being one of them, GMOs, which is genetically modified organisms. You've probably seen a lot of arguments regarding that. And then small farms have largely been impossible, especially organic farming. So just to cover a couple of these issues, you can understand why they are issues. So we looked at NAFTA. So a lot of the U.S. farming is highly subsidized by the U.S. government. So let's say corn, for example, corn farming, wheat farming, a lot of sugarcane farming as well. A lot of people from other countries, a lot of small-scale farming, especially from Mexico, they cannot compete with our prices. So we are able to price gouge a lot of corn, for example, just say. Because it's largely subsidized by the U.S. government. So our farmers are getting handouts, economic handouts from the United States government, allowing us to sell the produce at cheaper prices. Mexican farmers don't get these handouts, and therefore there are these subsidies, and therefore they can't compete with U.S. prices. So a lot of farms in Mexico, people who were able to survive by doing agriculture for a really long time, for generations, if not longer, no longer can compete. Even if it technically costs them less to produce what we produce. So actually a lot of the economic issues that Mexico has is largely tied to NAFTA. GMOs, so genetically modified, there's a lot of issues. There's some really good documentaries on Netflix that talk about this. It's not so much the health concern, although, we have this concept in environmental studies and in science, in natural science as well, called the precautionary principle, which basically means in science and in management and a lot of other aspects, you don't do something until you know that it's not going to damage anything. It's not going to harm anything. We really don't know with genetically modified organisms largely there is no proof over, the studies that have been done. There is minimal proof showing that there's a potential risk for human health. So I'm not arguing that GMOs have, and again, the risk is not really to human health either. It's largely to crop health. It's largely to the future of crops and farming as well. But there are a lot of issues. GMOs, from an economic industry perspective, they have largely taken over. They have erased the prospective future of small-scale farmers as well. Again, it's a very extensive issue. There's a lot of really good documentaries out there that sum up a lot of these issues. And then small-scale farms, again, people who try to be organic and not use GMOs and not use pesticides, which is a continual, endless cycle. We get resistance to these, and these are part of the issues with GMOs. It's not possible. So a lot of people have tried to be competitive and say, okay, well, we're going to do organic farming. It's the only way we can try and compete against the large-scale farms. But again, goes back to businesses having their hands in politics. Large ag businesses and industrialization, their small-scale farming, I hear this constantly, and when I talk to farmers as well as what you see in documentaries, is that in order to be able to register as an organic farm, you have to uh, basically hire somebody, a full-time person, just to be able to do all of the paperwork to be able to be registered as an organic farm. So it's very difficult and very challenging, and it costs a lot of money that a lot of small-scale farms don't have. So here's land use across the region. You can see, so these are basically mostly different types of farming. So specialty crop of livestock farming is the lime green, the light green. Mixed farming is the darker green. We've got commercial wheat and other small grain farming here as well. General farming, not quite sure what they mean by that. Livestock ranching, again, this is not really viable land, so it's largely livestock farming. There's a really good book that was published probably about 20 years ago now called Public Cow, or Private Cow at the Public Trough, that talks about a lot of the issues related to private animals, private livestock being put on public lands. Irrigated agriculture in the blue, so that is in the pockets where they have tried to do agriculture in these dry areas. The brown is Mediterranean agriculture, so largely here in Southern California, and looks like maybe parts of Florida. And then non-farming, so a lot of this region up in Canada, which just really isn't this area too, which just really isn't viable for farming. You have major manufacturing regions, and then key global links. So, I mean, obviously this is not all farmland, but this would be outside of residential areas that are largely farmlands. Sectoral transformation. So your book kind of jumps around and talks about the different economic activities in different units. Later on, they go into a bit more detail, but I wanted to provide this information now. So basically, when we talk, we're going to talk about 4 different economic sectors. So the primary activities are natural resource extraction. Secondary activities, which can also mean agriculture, right? Secondary is manufacturing or industrial. So basically, primary activities would be if we grow coffee. Secondary activities are we actually process the coffee to be sold. Third is, and I shouldn't say processing as in like one thing is exporting coffee beans, something else is actually toasting and roasting and grinding the coffee beans to be sold. Tertiary services would be services. So if we open cafes, for example, to actually sell the processed coffee, open stores to sell the processed coffee as well. Quaternary is, let's say we are doing education and research into how to improve coffee. So this is information processing, education as well. Sectoral transformation is this process of evolution of a nation's labor force. So where you go from one economic activity to the next. So you could see that a lot of countries might largely be based in primary activities with a less of a diversified economy. Sometimes they only have a few crops or a few areas of natural resources that they would be extracting and selling. Secondary, as they eventually go up. In most of North America, about 70% of the labor force is employed in tertiary and quaternary economic areas, which is quite high, and that's actually quite good for our labor force as well. So there's some factors that have influence. So what I want to talk about here largely was the sectoral transformation, this concept. Your book doesn't quite go into all of the 4 economic activities yet, but we'll talk about this a bit more when we get to other units. So part of, we've got a large country. Canada as well is very large, stretching from coast to coast. So, we have a different, this is a huge factor in the economies of North America. It's how have we created this continental economy? So there's a few factors that have happened here. We largely refer to connectivity. So this is not just about physical connection. Telecommunications is also a possibility. But we have created this large system of transportation networks of how we get goods and services from one area to the next within our country. And this has been a huge factor of how we are able to have such a large continental economy. Sectoral transformation is another factor, as well as there's a lot of location factors. So as geographers, when we look at location factors for explaining why things are where they are, we want to look at the different factors that help us understand why certain economic activities are where it is and how these patterns of economic activity are shaped. So why is petroleum refining located in the Gulf Coast, for example? And there is obviously massive amounts of petroleum that are from this region, but then why particularly refining is where it is. And again, a lot of this goes back to connectivity. In Silicon Valley, your book has a really good example. It talks about why Silicon Valley is this large technological hub. There's a interesting article I read about, it was from Oregon. I can't remember if it was Lapine or Prineville. I know I've been there quite a few times. Basically, this town was dying. They had no jobs for their youth, and so they were able to find a way to present themselves to tech companies, and they have basically large servers where they've become this cloud service hub, and it's really transformed the local communities because they've been able to bring a lot of jobs back to their communities. And, again, this was just like a mayor with a vision of trying to do something. So again, it's kind of understanding why these places are where they are. And there's a lot of, this is off-site, far removed, quite safe regarding, it's in the middle of nowhere. We don't have to have a lot of issues regarding tourism potentials and just kind of off the grid. So there's just a lot of, these are different things that we would look at as geographers of why are things located where they are and what's going on. So North America and the global economy. Again, this goes back to our role as quote unquote hegemonic force. We have been at the center of creating this economy that we have. And you remember, economy is a social construct. It's something that we've made. It's something that we've created. It is not something that existed. It's not a law or a rule. It is something completely that we have made. The United States has had a huge role in creating what we'd call the modern global economy. We were the ones that have been involved in creating the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, which its aim was to reduce world trade barriers. Again, all of these things because they were advantageous to us. Whether or not they will continue to be advantageous to us in the future is something that is being argued, because some trade organizations, some trade agreements have not resulted in being very advantageous to us. The concept of G8, think of it as like the Great Eight top economies, top nations, or the top economies in the world. We have had this huge role in influencing a lot of world politics. And when we talk about the IMF and World Bank, especially when we talk about here in the Caribbean, remember, the North America, predominantly the United States, has had a huge hand in these countries where we have created this system of debt. There's this really good book called Autobiography of an Economic Hitman, and I highly recommend reading it. He was an economic hitman, and he basically talks about how they go into other countries. I think he largely talks about Latin America and Africa, but he goes into these other countries and he's forced to, or his job is to force presidents and governments to sign free trade agreements or accept loans and basically become indebted to these organizations. There's a lot of issues with these organizations. Again, we could have a whole separate course on these alone, but the book's really interesting to kind of understand how influential these organizations are to the rest of the world, and how we have coerced countries into getting into the situations that they currently are. So in America as well, we talked about immigrants, but we have attracted a lot of skilled immigrants. We're also losing a lot of skilled immigrants. I find it really interesting. You've talked about, seeing a lot of the countries that were on Trump's proposed travel bans. A lot of those countries, we actually have tech immigrants or different immigrants who have come to the United States as entrepreneurs, have formed their own businesses, and have largely revolutionized our tech industries and modernized our industries. And a lot of the people who have been behind those were not, they're American, but they're either American immigrants or children of immigrants from a lot of these countries. Another common trend that we've seen growing is outsourcing. Most of you have probably gotten a telemarketer call where you might not have completely understood the person very well. I'm trying to be really polite here. A lot of our even customer relation services are now outsourced, where we are not just manufacturing, but other types of services as well. So you might get a call from somebody in a completely different time zone for a company that is in the United States, and they are providing customer service. So a lot of these services are being outsourced, meaning we're hiring people from other countries to do the work rather than employing people in the United States, again, because labor is cheaper. So social issues. We have a lot of social issues here in the United States that definitely don't vary too much from other countries. We have got one of the largest gaps between wealth and poverty. So one of the largest gaps of equality in the country. Access to education, and these are all things that I would say have definitely been growing issues with the current administration. Healthcare and aging. We are living in, quote unquote, a very industrialized, very wealthy nation, and not everybody has access to the same education. And, not even just talking about university education, I'm talking about public education. Not everyone has access to healthcare. We've got a huge aging population, the baby boomers, and the aging population is going to continue to expand as baby boomers are aging and going into retirement. We have a lot of racial tensions in this country that are not new. And I think, a lot of people could argue that a lot of the attention to racial issues, as well as racism, this growing call of attention, could be a really positive thing because, there's been a lot of prejudice and discrimination in this country, and this has been something that a lot of people haven't been aware of because it's not something that they are subjected to themselves, especially in mainstream or in mainland United States. And we still have a lot of inequality. So not just, I'm sorry, I'm looking at some of these words down here, right? We have not just talking about racial equality, economic equality, there's gender equality. We have a lot of equality issues in this country, equality to the same rights and basic resources. Just having rights to access to clean drinking water is not something that is ensured in the United States anymore. The United Nations recently did a study in the last couple of months, and they were looking at poverty and equality in the United States, and they said that it was actually quite alarming the number of people in the United States who don't have food security, who don't have access to the same basic human rights that other industrialized nations do have. One thing they did point out, though, was that while we do see a lot of poverty in the United States, a lot more than most people are aware of, the level of poverty that we are seeing is not the same kind of poverty that you would see in places that we will continue to talk about in other regions of the world, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Central South America, in the Caribbean, for example. Level of poverty in the United States might be $20,000 or less a year. We live in a country where we still do have access to food stamps. You do have access to free healthcare. You do have access, if you are really poor, you can gain access to a lot of these resources, whereas a lot of other countries don't. And we might find people living on less than $1 a day. And a couple other enduring social issues come to gender. So gender, not necessarily males versus females, and this is something that I'd say probably has continued to grow. So this here is talking about the gender gaps. When we talk about gender gap, we are talking about basically what they're referring to as earning ratios down here. So this is a percent of female to male. So basically, for every dollar that a white male, and this is a racial inequality as well, for every dollar that a white male earns, or here they're just saying a man earns, these are the states where women earn approximately, 72 cents, 78 cents. So on a national level, women earn 78 cents for every dollar that a man earns. The earning ratios are a bit better in the darker states, worse in the lighter states. But, I'd say we also have an issue with gender in the United States as well, where we've seen this growing movement of people, transgender populations, which is becoming a bit more of a norm. It's something that was not discussed, even it's really been something that's been popping up in the last 10, 20 years. So there's a lot of, I don't want to say new gender issues, but these are more mainstream gender issues where these are populations that now are finding more access to the mainstream culture and speaking out. So it's not necessarily that we have more people, quote unquote, dealing with these issues, but these issues are becoming a lot more common in everyday language and place. We didn't have the bathroom gender issues 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's now with growing openness regarding and acceptability of transgender populations that we have more people coming out as being transgender. And therefore we see these issues growing, if you will. So these anti-LGBTQ sentiments as well growing, which is a kind of a pushback against this growing openness to accept people of other genders and sexual orientations as well. So that's the end for this unit. Have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions.